morning, everyone. I'm going to talk to you guys about how we've implemented Amazon Web Services at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. We're part of the Department of Health and Human Services. What drove our cloud migration was a site called Healthcare.gov that I think people are familiar with. We had a need, my team, to build 3 systems on that website that were designed to improve the consumer experience, to streamline operations, and to scale to very high volumes. Those were the streamlined application, the scalable login system, and window shopping. Excuse me. Some of the characteristics of the systems we had to build are that they needed to handle extreme traffic spikes. During open enrollment, we see very, very high volumes. We see volumes drop off the rest of the year. The security posture of the system, it's a very high visibility website. It's a target, and so we wanted to make sure we had a great security posture. The public visibility, there's a lot of attention paid to Healthcare.gov. And lastly, we needed to rapidly evolve these systems, particularly in the first and second years of open enrollment. We had a changing environment. We had traffic volumes rising and lowering. And we wanted to make sure that we could roll system changes out very quickly and have that agility that we needed. In our Amazon environment, we have a couple of tech stacks that we have deployed. We have one Linux stack, and so we're using both Node.js and MySQL and Go and Postgres to run those applications that I mentioned earlier. We do have some Windows environments, and we also stood up Direct Connect so we could basically make AWS part of our data center, bring it in and make it a part of our environment at CMS. So how did we do this and how quickly did we do this? We went from concept to reality. We went in about 90 days from the award to being production ready. We leveraged the FedRAMP authority that HHS had put in place, and that's actually for East and West. So our use of AWS is in the commercial environments in East and West. And importantly, we set up an audit and we received an authority to operate as what's called a general support system, a GSS, and what that enabled us to do is to get approval for AWS, the platform, so that CMS could bring other applications into that environment and we could grow beyond those initial 3 that I laid out. So what were the results of our first 15 months? We did have a successful open enrollment across those 3 systems. We offloaded a very, very significant amount of traffic from the other data centers that are running other parts of Healthcare.gov. We did maintain the system uptime goals that we had laid out for ourselves, and we were able to scale to the volumes. We never sort of ran out of computing power or had to throttle users because the system was overburdened. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more later about how we're evolving our use of AWS to be more automated. We've learned an awful lot in that first 15 months. So I want to talk about one of the big things that we learned for us, a key lesson, was that when you move into a true sort of cloud environment and out of a traditional data center, it really flips the model around. So if you look at what we've done in traditional data centers over the last couple of years, capacity is a scarce resource. There are long lead times if you want to get new infrastructure. And so what we found ourselves doing is we sort of starve development resources. It's most important that production stay up and stable and the customers can get in. And so there are sort of fewer and fewer servers in our stack. As we move to a cloud computing environment, we found that the opposite is true, that the resources are limited not by any sort of lead time to procure them, but just by the budget that we have. And so what we see in AWS is the inverse of this, that we have a lot of development resources. And I think as Mark mentioned earlier, we have room, we have capacity to experiment, to try new things and decide if we want to roll them out to production. As I was thinking about this diagram backstage, I think the one change that I would make to this is that the triangle in the cloud compute is bigger. It's a little bit misleading here. And again, because of some of the cost efficiencies, we were able to run more compute resources in AWS than we ever were in the traditional data center model. So that's an important value there. And how do we leverage the cloud in government? To me, there's a combination of 2 things that seem like they might contradict one another, but I think they go together very nicely. The first is we've heard of some of the services that have just been launched. And we get requirements. An example that we got just recently was we needed to basically sort of have a hot replication between databases in 2 different availability zones. In a traditional data center model, we would have either procured some sort of COTS software to do that, or we would have built that. Since we're in Amazon, they have a service that does that. They have RDS. And so we're able to basically leverage that service and implement that in a very, very cost-effective manner. But the flip side of that is that everything in Amazon has APIs. And so there are these pre-built services, but what we're able to do is by leveraging the APIs, we're able to link those services together in the way that we need and to build the programs and tools that support our production operations. So how do we run at scale in AWS? Again, these are things that were new to us as we moved from the traditional data center model to AWS. We are running DevOps, and what DevOps means for us is that the development and the operation teams are very, very closely linked. The operations teams know what is in development. The development teams know what the operational model is, and so nobody is surprised as code is getting released. We know what to watch for when a release goes out. We're watching the metrics. We're watching what's happening in production. We are able, through the APIs I mentioned before, we manage our infrastructure in version control. If anything ever goes wrong, we can go back and see where. We can unit test our infrastructure, which is an amazing capability. We're following the 12-factor app principles. If people aren't familiar with that, again, it's a way of building stateless systems in the cloud. And it's a way of taking advantage of the capabilities the cloud offers you. And we're moving to minimize our downtimes by automating the deploys, and we have some systems that might be down for a few minutes as we do deploys. We're moving some of our systems to sort of blue-green deploy models, and what that means is there's no downtime at all. We spin up a new environment, we move the traffic over, we turn off the old environment. Nobody ever was aware that we were doing anything in production. And so last I wanted to mention where we're sort of evolving our use of AWS. The API use I mentioned before, we're building a system sort of internal to CMS that we call Core VPC. That's just sort of our internal code name for it. But on top of Amazon's infrastructure as a service, we're building a platform as a service that supports our needs. We're leveraging the AWS APIs. We have built in all of the requirements for CMS's system, so all of our security, our hardening standards, are built in, and that's at the VPC and the EC2 level. And so as we bring those things up, they're hardened, we know they're gonna work, we know they're tested, they're compliant with all of our rules. And I wanted to mention, I just read an article a couple of weeks ago from Martin Fowler that was called Monolith First, and I really like the idea, which is that you need to derive a platform from a successful application. And so what we did at CMS is we looked at our first 12 months of usage. We looked at how we had been managing the applications, and then we started to build a platform to support those needs. And that will continue to evolve, but it's a way of building that platform out so that it's easier for every single customer to use as more and more people come into that environment. And again, that's expanding over time. It's not a static thing, but it will grow over time. Thank you.